So let's talk about the prerequisites, basically what's required in order to take this series, Introduction to Python. The first is your skills prerequisites, and basically you should be pretty adequate with a computer. You don't have to be an expert with a computer and have an A+ certification or anything like that, but you probably should know how to type. Right? You are going to have to install VS Code. So there's something called an IDE, we'll talk about a little bit later, that you're going to have to install onto your system. So you need to be able to install that onto your system. There's some extensions and settings and that type of deal. Basically, you have to be comfortable going into a settings menu and modifying the settings. Beyond that, you're going to have to be able to go through a file structure. So when we read from files or save to files, basically when I talk about something like your root directory, you have to be able to figure out what I'm talking about, but that's all some relatively simple things. Basically, what we're going to be teaching you is relatively simple, so if you're either comfortable with a computer, or you can take a moment, you can breathe in, breathe out, and then go back to simply working on it, you should be able to go through everything that we're going to be teaching you in this program. Now we need to get to the hardware requirements for this program. And basically the hardware requirements for this program, as we see it say in the technology world, is you can probably run everything we're doing on a potato. And when I say a potato, basically I just mean a very, 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 very low powered system. So Python itself as a programming language doesn't require much of anything. The language itself doesn't require much of anything. You could literally probably use a computer from 2005 or earlier and be absolutely a-okay. If you want to write Python scripts using a Raspberry Pi 4, literally a $50 computer, that will work fine for you. When I do the in-person classes here in Asheville, our lab computers are actually 2012 MacBook Pros. So these are things now are 13 years old. I buy them for $130 a piece. They're a dual core processor with 4 gigs of RAM, didn't even upgrade the RAM, and they do just a fabulous job. So when I say you can use almost any hardware as far as Python is concerned, that is basically what I'm saying. Now when you're looking at this, I actually use an M2 Max MacBook Pro now, but to be clear, you do not need to use that. You need to use basically whatever computer you have. Again, with the Python world, you will hear about x86 processors and ARM processors. These are the types of CPUs. With Python, they will run on what's called an ARM processor just fine. So if you have a Raspberry Pi where you're using M series Mac computer, those will work fine for you and you shouldn't have any issues. The one place where hardware will become a concern for you as you go into the future, so not this series but in the future, is when we start adding what are called frameworks and basically additional components to our Python code. So when we want to add artificial intelligence, there's a framework called Ollama that gives you LLM capability locally on your system. Here's the thing, that needs a lot of resources. It sort of works on this. It's one of those things that Python works fine. Ollama, well, it works. Let's just say it works, right? That's where you'll have an issue with hardware. Or computer vision. There's something called OpenCV, which is a computer vision framework that allows you to add the ability basically for your Python script to be able to see the world. Again, Python itself doesn't need a lot. OpenCV does. So again, you can run that on a Raspberry Pi or even a 13-year-old computer, but it is going to start to be slow. So when you're thinking about this, as you're thinking about, especially as you're going into the future, what computer you need, right now, you don't need much of anything. You just need the computer that you have. What you need to be thinking about is, as you go into the future, do you care about artificial intelligence? Do you care about computer vision? Do you care about those tasks? Because those will require a lot more resources and will require a much better computer. Again, using an M2 Max MacBook Pro, when I use things like Ollama or OpenCV computer vision on that just works swimmingly well. It just works absolutely awesome. Whereas when I try to do that on this, not so much. It does actually work, but not very well. Now, the final thing to talk about is operating system requirements. So there's the hardware, right? That's the CPU, RAM, storage, that type of deal. And then there's the operating system, Windows, Mac OS, Linux, generally Ubuntu. And so that is something that you're going to need to be thinking about. So in this particular series of classes, for the introduction to series, whatever operating system you use should be fine. Mac OS will work great, Linux will work great, and Windows will work. One of the things you have to understand is I'm not trying to be mean about Windows because I hate Windows or something like that. I used to be a Windows fanboy. Again, I was an MCSE for many years. I used to love Windows. The reality is Windows is quirky. Windows is very quirky. When you just want to be able to write code and run code, Mac OS and Linux are generally going to be easiest to run the code, and Windows, you might get some weird problems. And so this is something to think about. Now, for the classes that we're going to be teaching, the sessions that we're going to have here, Windows should not be a major issue. We are going to have a series on interacting with the operating system, so we'll have a number of sessions on that. An important thing to understand is that Windows uses different commands and it interacts with commands differently than either Mac or Linux does. And so there might be some quirks there, and if all you have is a Windows machine, you might just kind of have to follow along and watch. Now, there's something like we use the ping command, and with how Windows uses the ping command, it's literally different than how Mac and Linux does, so there might be some quirks there. The other thing too is file paths. Basically in the Windows world, they use backslashes for file paths. In Linux and the Mac world, they use forward slashes for file paths. And so if you're trying in your code, if you're writing out the location of a file or folder, again, that might cause you some different issues, whether you're dealing with Windows or whether you're dealing with Mac or Linux. As we go forward into the future, a lot of these problems are going to become a lot more frustrating when you get into different series, when we do different classes with AI and OpenCV and that kind of stuff in the future. Because basically the security, how Windows does security and all talks is tedious. The best word to say is tedious. I literally have a robot. So this is my robot. You may hear me talk about my Lewis Rossman hunting robot, and that's what this thing is. This is actually a full-fledged robot. It uses something called OpenCV to track faces and that type of deal. And this is a real computer. You may not see it, but this is something called basically along the lines of NUC, Next Unit Compute. Right here, it's a 4 gigahertz processor. It's got 32 gigs of RAM. Really, really, really awesome. When I bought that, it came with Windows 11 Professional already installed, and I was going to use Windows 11 Professional to build the robot just so I would have that experience. It's like I don't use Windows a lot, so I'm just going to use Windows in this particular project, blah, blah. Yeah, it lasted about 5 hours on that machine. After about 5 hours, I got so tired of it, I just wiped it and put Ubuntu on it to make my life a lot easier. So that's kind of reality. So if you've got a Windows machine, you should be able to follow along. Just realize you might run into more problems than the other students do, just because that's how it works. Again, a lot of these classes I'm going to be running directly off of the Mac. So this is a Mac operating system. Everything should work fine there. There are some interesting things, most likely in further series that we do after this particular introduction. We interact with the operating system, and I will say that Linux has many more command line applications than the Mac OS or Windows do. So there's some times when it actually makes a lot more sense to use an Ubuntu machine, and so that's kind of where we're at. Basically, what I would say is for a lot of these classes, Mac is the best operating system to use. It just is. Ubuntu is the second best, and if you've got Windows, well, it's what you got. It's what you got, so we'll try to make do. I will try to do my best to help you out, but just realize there might be some quirks there. So there are some thoughts on the prerequisites. Basically, if you've been using a computer a while, you're comfortable installing and uninstalling software and getting into some configurations, you should be fine. Again, I will say Mac is probably going to be the best hardware and best operating system to use in order to follow along, but it doesn't have to be the best out there. You don't have to spend $3,000 on a system. Again, this is actually a MacBook Pro. It has Ubuntu installed on it. I get these from Backmarket market for $130 a piece. I buy it for $130. I buy a solid state drive for $30, shove that in here, and $160 I have a machine that is just fine for doing Python. The big thing is basically the operating system. It's not going to be the hardware itself. So that's one of those things to consider. Again, I'm going to try to make everything so it works for everybody. Just understand, look, I'm not being mean to you if you run on Windows. It's just whenever you go to a tech conference and everybody pulls out their Mac, let's just say there's a reason, right? When everybody at a conference can basically can afford whatever system they want to, and they all have Mac, there is a reason for it. So just one of those things to consider. But don't worry, again, follow along. This isn't costing you any money anyway, so you can follow along and see how easy it is to be able to code in Python.